The tragic Connecticut school shooting, which claimed 26 lives, was carried out by a young man suffering from Asbergers syndrome. The event raised the profile of the disorder and other forms of autism, but in many ways, the medical community is just starting to grapple with it. Craig Mauro visited one organization with a way of employing autistic adults.
Brenda Weitzberg's son, Oran, is a college graduate, but his autism made it difficult for him to maintain a job after school. The experiences led Weitzberg to found Aspiritech, a nonprofit company outside Chicago that employs people with autism to conduct quality assurance for third-party websites.
Heard about a Danish company where they figured out that software testing, the attention to detail, the focus was an excellent fit with the traits, the strengths of high-functioning autism. And I thought if they could do it in Denmark, we certainly can do it here.
Organizations like Aspiritech are relatively rare, but the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say autism is increasing, now at 1 in 88 children born in the United States. There are between 1 and 1.5 million Americans diagnosed with the disorder. Alan Zhang, the son of Chinese immigrants, is among 14 people who currently work at Aspiritech. His mother says the job is more than a paycheck for her son.
For a young man, if he doesn't do productive work, he could do some kind of destructive work. There's nothing in the middle. So coming here, he feel proud, he make useful to the society, he feel happy about himself. So it's a big thing for the mental health.
Through outings and workshops, Aspiritech also develops its employees' social skills, an area where people with autism can struggle, sometimes costing them their jobs.
So over time, one of our goals is to have some of our employees be able to move on to other mainstream workplaces. And we've had a few success stories so far with that.
The last 2 quarters of 2012 were Aspiritech's best ever. The company is expanding to increase its revenues 5-fold this year. In fact, they're looking for a larger office space now to expand into. Craig Mauro, CCTV, Highland Park, Illinois.
Joining me for more on this from Newton, Massachusetts, is William Kiernan, Director at the Institute for Community Inclusion. Again, thank you for joining us on Biz Asia America. Let me ask you this. Mental disability, a lot of folks avoid talking about this issue. We want to take it head on. What's the government doing to help those with mental issues, such as the one that you just heard?
Well, the government has got a number of policies that have been in place for a long period of time. Certainly the Americans with Disabilities Act that prohibits discriminatory practices against persons with disabilities. But more on an affirmative perspective, the government has an initiative, actually the administration has announced an initiative about creating employment opportunities for 100,000 persons with disabilities in the government sector. Probably the other area that the government is looking at is encouraging employers to hire persons with disabilities through some advocacy, but also more recently, whether changing the criteria for contracting with private employers so that those employers that have a typical representation of a workforce, including persons with disabilities, may get a preference in certain types of contracting. So I think there's a range of things.
Not all mental disabilities are so obvious sometimes, especially in the workplace. Everyone's trying to keep a very professional relationship with each other. But what can employers and what can HR officials do to make sure that those employees that are identified with mental disabilities or come to the workplace with mental disabilities are comfortable?
I think there's a number of things that employers can do. One of which is to certainly work with the person with disabilities about what types of accommodations are most useful for them in adjusting the workplace so that, in fact, the person can do their job more effectively. The other is working with the coworkers and explaining to some of the coworkers, in some instances when what we refer to as a hidden disability, where in fact it's not apparent that the person has a disability, there may be some unusual ways that a person has of interacting or responding, and by informing the coworkers, oftentimes a problem can be avoided by letting the coworkers know that this is a typical type of response and not an unusual behavior.
You know, I've worked at so many different places around the world, and one similarity is nobody wants to talk about this particular subject, and certainly most employees would avoid this topic. But in your experience, from a global community standpoint, what are companies, or even for that matter, governments doing around the world to make it easier for those who need help to get help?
Well, I think the governments are really beginning to realize a couple of things. One is that persons with disabilities actually do quite well in the workplace, and when they're engaged in work, they actually are happier. And I believe that the comment in the previous reference was about it's not just earnings, it's also a sense of social acceptance and contribution, which really makes a big difference for persons with disabilities in the workplace. But I think governments in some countries have a quota system. Our country does not. A quota system that implies that a certain percentage of the workforce has to be persons with disabilities. And in other countries, there's an anti-discrimination system, such as in this country here. But what we're finding is that the more exposure that people without disabilities have to persons with disabilities, the more acceptance there is. Certainly removing the stigma and encouraging people to interact with persons with and without disabilities has made a big difference in school inclusion and now in the workplace.
William Kiernan, thank you so much for helping us better understand this important issue.